Alright, welcome to your next lesson. Let's talk about the narrative structure. Alright, the sequence of events that stories follow. You've read some stories so far in your lessons for Unit 1, and I'm sure you recognize that stories usually follow a beginning, middle, and end pattern. When we talk about stories, we are talking about narratives. The purpose of a narrative is to tell a story. These two words are very similar to each other. Narratives can be fiction or non-fiction. Think about memoirs, which are a biography of someone's life, or something like a fairy tale, which is often in a fantasy world that doesn't exist in reality. A narrative can also be called a story. And that's really important to understand. So what is the structure of a story? We often think beginning, middle, and end, right? Well, another way of putting it is orientation, complication, and resolution. So, we can take the idea of beginning, middle, end and sort of make it more advanced and use the terms orientation, complication, and resolution to show how a narrative structure works. So what are the features of each part of a story structure? Well, let's talk about that. When we're thinking about orientation, we are introducing the story to the audience or the reader. This happens at the beginning, and you often see things like description of the setting, right? The time and place that the story takes place. Characterization. We start to learn about the characters in the story and their personality traits as well. And the really important thing about orientation is that it gives the audience an idea of what's going to be important in the narrative moving forward. And that's a really important idea to understand. That orientation introduces us to the important elements of the story. It's also important when we're looking at orientation, we decide, well, what is the perspective of this story? Is it first person? Maybe second person? Or third? What is the perspective? Alright, so that's orientation. Introducing you to the important elements of a story. But as you've learned before, a story isn't interesting. In fact, a story is very boring and not a story at all if you don't have a conflict. So, we get to the complication part, and that's where you see what is the conflict. The main events, right? Major events of the story happen in the middle, or during complications, right? The conflict. Something needs to change. Without conflict, you don't have a very good story. And it's really important that when you're reading a story, you understand what the conflict of the story is. It could be an internal conflict where you need to change your mind about something, or an external conflict between people. We've talked about types of conflict, and usually we figure out what the conflict is during the complication stage of a story, or the middle of a story. And then we finally get to the resolution. We're reaching the end, right? So whatever the complication is, whatever the conflict, it needs to be solved at the end of the story. Doesn't mean that it's going to be a happy ending. Some stories don't end the way you expect. They can be tragic. But let's talk about resolution, okay? So this is the conflict being solved, right? There is a solution to the conflict. And often we get an idea of what the theme of the story is as well by the end of the story. There's usually a message, and the message is the strongest near the end of the story. The climax of the story can take place, well, anywhere around here. Sometimes you see the climax in the middle of a story, but sometimes in other stories you'll see the climax near the very end. The turning point, as well, is what we call it. So just remember, there's a solution to the conflict. And this does not mean a happy ending. Not always a happy ending. So now we've sort of taken our thinking and brought it to the next level. For a long time you might have looked at a story's progression as beginning, middle, and end. We'll now start to think about orientation, complication, and resolution, and think about the features that are involved in each part of a story. And that will help you with your next lesson and the activities included. So good luck, guys, and keep on moving along.